My name is Anjali Anwar. I'm a second year PhD student at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. And today I'll be presenting on our study on the impact of COVID-19 on women gig workers in India, which is titled Gig Platforms as for Infrastructure, a case study of women beauty workers in India. The study was conducted in July and August of 2020, along with Dr. Julie Hui. The other authors, Michaelanne Thomas and Kentaro Tomaya, joined us during the writing and analysis part of the research. So before I begin, I'm going to just quickly cover some quick background. With the onset of COVID-19, as with most of the world, India witnessed overall economic slowdown, particularly impacting traditional establishments in the service sector, such as salons. There was rising unemployment alongside the mismanagement of the crisis by the Indian state, as well as overburdening of already failing public health infrastructure. On the other hand, on-demand gig platforms remained active and were increasingly being framed as essential services for urban society to continue functioning by various stakeholders. So you have like the public media, as well as the state, industry voices, and of course the platforms themselves. However, we note that despite workers continuing gig workers continuing their access to work even during periods of lockdown, gig workers face various struggles, like the majority of the Indian informal labor force, and they anyhow lacked social security from whether it was from the state or from employment. There were also increasing protests by workers at this time. So we were trying to unpack this tension of platforms continuing their functionality and some even increasing their profits because of the pandemic, whereas the situation of workers and their struggles were also increasing. It's against this backdrop that we wanted to understand if gig platforms are serving as infrastructure and essential resources for urban society, what were gig workers relying on to survive on a day-to-day basis? And therefore, these are the questions that we ask. What infrastructural promise do home service gig platforms present during the COVID-19 pandemic for their gig workforce? What challenges do women beauty gig workers face in accessing this infrastructural promise? And how do they navigate these challenges? To approach our questions, we use qualitative methodologies and conducted 21 semi-structured phone interviews with women beauty workers in Bangalore. I used snowball sampling from previous studies to recruit participants. Out of the 21, there were 20 gig workers, primarily from 2 home service platforms and a couple from another smaller one. There was also 1 salon owner. So when we talk about infrastructural promise that the platform presented for gig workers, what do we mean by infrastructure to begin with? We mobilize the conception of infrastructure as large-scale socio-technical systems that are essential for society to function, and therefore as systems that generate public value, for instance, roadways, electricity grids, and so forth. These have historically been associated with the state, whether in terms of ownership or control and regulation, or both. Against this definition, we look at the infrastructural promise that platforms present for gig workers in terms of how they're becoming essential for workers to access not only work, but also financial and health support. For instance, small loans, COVID insurance, COVID vaccines, accident insurance, and so forth. So to quickly summarize this background context, we have the persistence of informality in Indian labor markets, which has left low-power service workers very vulnerable. And then in the context of the pandemic, we have low demand in traditional service jobs, such as salons, as well as the formal permits that platforms have got during periods of lockdown, which allowed them to function while other businesses were shut. And all of these conditions have resulted in the increased reliance of gig workers on platforms. To illustrate this, we have a quote from P3, who is a salon owner, and she's been running a small informal salon for quite a few years now. And she comes from a pretty well-off socioeconomic background, but she discusses the challenges that she's faced in accessing financial support and bank support. She says, "I'm not getting any loan from the bank. That is a big problem for us. I don't want to take anything from my husband. I want to be independent. So the government has to help women like us. No, we have property, rented the house, everything, but it belongs to my husband. Nobody is ready to give me a loan. I have everything, license, PAN card, everything. And this kind of like exclusion of marginalized groups such as women workers is also true in terms of like formal health establishments. However, when we spoke to the women to understand how they experience the infrastructural promise of platforms against the persistent kind of like exclusions that they've been like living with in India, we witnessed a more untold side of the story. We encountered the myriad of challenges that the women have to deal with when they're actually trying to access the platform's infrastructural promise. Some of these challenges are broader socioeconomic and cultural things that are happening in the background and not necessarily in control of the platform, whereas others directly come out of platform design and policies such as limited helpline access or pay reductions and so forth. P13 highlights how the platform's limited helpline access policy during the pandemic. So before they could get in touch with the platform managers and so forth from a call button that they had in the app, which was then later removed during the pandemic, and how this made it impossible for her to get accident insurance after a really bad accident that she had. She says, they have accident insurance, but didn't give me. The day of the accident, my husband took photos and we sent it to my manager. My manager just canceled the upcoming appointments I had. So far, they didn't say anything about insurance, and I don't really know how to ask them. There is no number. Since the lockdown, they have stopped the helpline feature. Before we had it. We then analyze the specific infrastructural promises, we then analyze the specific infrastructural promises made by the platform against the specific challenges which made it difficult or impossible for workers to access them, as well as the additional unpaid labors that the women had to perform in trying to access these promises and also just trying to perform their platform work. This table kind of summarizes this. We don't have time to get into it, but do have a look at it. Based on our analysis, we then theorize private gig platforms as for infrastructure, which is defined as widespread privatized socio-technical systems that promise access to critical resources, but instead push the burden of access onto marginalized communities of users, in our case, women beauty gig workers. The aim of this framing is to emphasize the public value and role of infrastructure and contrast it with the private ownership and control of gig platforms. This table highlights this through a comparison of for infrastructure with real infrastructure. For instance, real infrastructure actually serves a public purpose, whereas for infrastructure appears to serve a public purpose, but primarily serves private goals like profit motives and so forth. Thank you so much. Here's a quick summary of the paper, and we have some additional findings also associated with for infrastructure. Do read the paper, Gig Platforms as for Infrastructure, Case Study of Women Beauty Gig Workers in India. Again, thank you for listening.